It gives me great pleasure to introduce our guest today on WION World is One, Professor S Jayakumar, the former Deputy Prime Minister of Singapore. Professor Jayakumar is a veteran statesman and a diplomat who has helmed portfolios in foreign affairs, law and more. He has recently authored a book titled Governing, a Singapore Perspective. He joins us today on WION to discuss some key insights about governance, especially in a post-pandemic world. Thanks so much, Professor Jayakumar, for joining us today. Now let's start with talking about your book. You have penned a book that offers a rare behind-the-scenes look into governance tactics. So tell us about some of the big takeaways for future political personalities.
Well, first of all, you need to understand Singapore. I'm sure many of your viewers are familiar with Singapore, but some may not be. So what's important to understand is that my book is about governing of Singapore. And I'm pleasantly surprised that it is some interest in your organization and for your viewers. And thank you very much for this opportunity to speak to you.
Our pleasure, sir.
What are the takeaways? Well, the takeaways really are that for a small country like Singapore, as with other countries, we'll have both constant challenges as well as new challenges. But what are the constant challenges? It is how to keep Singapore's economic growth going. We are a small country with no resources. Basically, human resources and talent is what's kept Singapore going.
Right.
How to keep it going when our demographic population profile is changing? We are becoming an aging society. How to keep economic growth when at the same time there's political sensitivity to bringing in too many and too fast foreign talent.
Right.
This is a challenge. Secondly, how to keep our racial and religious harmony going. We have many religions, races, and languages in Singapore. And the social fabric and harmony must be maintained. Third is how to keep Singapore safe and secure for both Singaporeans and foreigners.
Right.
My book deals with some of the law and order challenges, and law and order in a situation where you have changing values and expectations and attitudes of the people and pressures. For example, I talk about the death penalty and other kinds of punishments. How long can you maintain this in the face of international trends and changing attitudes within Singapore? So these are some of the constant challenges which we will face, as with other countries. Then there are new challenges. I think the world has to face the fact that we'll have disruptive forces. COVID-19 was one example of a disruptive force. There can be many others. Climate change, for example, especially for small island countries, is a major challenge. It's a long-term challenge. Then social media. Social media has potential for good, but it's also, as shown in many countries, is a potential for mischief and problems for our country. It can lead to fake news.
Right.
It can lead to cyber attacks. It has also been manipulated by foreign agents and governments to influence politics and elections in countries.
Right.
So these are just some examples of the takeaways for future leaders.
All right, sir, going into my next question now, your inspiration behind the book was to keep Singapore's success story going. Now, Singapore is a global business hub, but how has this success story changed during the pandemic in particular, and what has been the key learning for you when it comes to governance?
Key learning points when it comes to governance. First, let me explain. You may find it strange that Singapore leaders have almost an obsession with keeping the success story going. Why is that? Perhaps I should put things in context. Singapore is a small country, and to give you an idea and your viewers how small it is, It is a city-state with about 5 million population.
Right.
You take India, many of its cities, whereas Mumbai, 12 million, or Delhi, 11 million, or Bangalore, 8 million. Each of your cities in India has a bigger population than Singapore. But Singapore is not only a city, it is also the sovereign state. Now, for large countries like India, if you have one of your pockets, one of your states run into some difficulties, economic or other difficulties, the rest of India survives.
Right.
The rest of India continues. But for Singapore, we are the city and the country and the state. So the success is important. Failure is not an option. So you'll find pretty much all the leaders have a compulsive obsession to make sure that Singapore must succeed.
Right.
Well, that is the reason about what I was explaining about success story going. Now, how do you keep the success story going? I think it all boils down to people. By that, I mean that Singapore's success can be attributed to having good talent and good leaders at all levels. Not only ministers, civil service, professions, private sector.
Right.
But the other side of the coin is you need a population that is acutely aware of the vulnerabilities and fragility of Singapore, so that when they have to choose leaders, when they have to choose governments, they are aware that Singapore is not, quote unquote, an ordinary country.
Right.
As you know, the history of Singapore, we did not expect to be independent. We separated from Malaysia and suddenly found ourselves to be an independent country. So these are some of the things that we have to bear in mind.
Right.
And that's the minds of the leaders at all times.
Right. My next question, Professor, another insight in your book, Prime Minister Lee's transition plans, which have been delayed by the pandemic, of course. You have categorically said that with the pandemic presenting an unprecedented crisis, now is not the time for political succession. So what, in your view, would be the challenges of changing horses in midstream?
Let me explain that one of the reasons for stability and continuity in Singapore has been that each of the prime ministers took considerable pains to build up a successor generation, a successor team. For background for our viewers, Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong is the third Prime Minister of independent Singapore. The first Prime Minister was Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, second Mr. Goh Chok Tong, and the third Mr. Lee Hsien Loong, who took over as Prime Minister in 2004. He has made it clear before COVID that he has no intention to cling on to power.
Right.
So he announced that this recent election in July would be the last that he would lead as Prime Minister. And he also said that he hoped to step down as Prime Minister before he reached the age of 70, which would be around April of 2022. That was all before COVID. The point I make in my book is that you should treat the COVID crisis almost like a war.
Right.
It's a battleground. The enemy is invisible. The enemy is lurking in various parts of Singapore and the world. And you need to treat it as a high priority emergency.
Absolutely.
The point I made was, if the crisis abates fairly soon, I think the people will understand if Prime Minister wishes to keep to his timeline and step down. I posed a what if question. What if the crisis persists much longer than we hope?
Right.
As in other countries, there have been second waves, third waves. What happens if it lasts several more years, closer to the next general election? I mooted the point that it may be necessary for Prime Minister to revisit
Right.
the timelines and, if necessary, continue to lead Singapore even in the next elections. So that there will be no misunderstanding, I did not say that he must continue at all costs. It depends on how this crisis unfolds. And as I use the phrase, in a battleground, in a battlefield, you don't change horses in midstream. It would not be wise. That is my message.
Absolutely. Moving on, let's discuss the ties between India and Singapore now. Singapore, of course, will be commencing its term as coordinator of the ASEAN-India dialogue relations next year. And Prime Minister Lee has said that Singapore looks forward to deepening ties with India. Now, Singapore, of course, is a prominent business hub for Indian professionals. So how do you see the Singapore-India relationship panning out in the future?
I can speak with some first-hand knowledge because I was foreign minister for 10 years. And I can inform your viewers that Singapore-India relations are very good. And I think this is because we have conducted the relations at, shall we say, three levels. First is on the economic front. Trade and investment ties have been strong. And in fact, even during this pandemic, there have been movement on both trade and investment. Secondly, ties between leaders. All our leaders, all our prime ministers and ministers have had very good ties through personal meetings and engagements.
Right.
I would say that this is something that we have to reinforce, especially when there are new and younger ministers coming in to India, as well as we are expecting a 4G leadership in Singapore. Thirdly, there's been very good cooperation between India and Singapore in international forums, conferences, and bodies. And of all these corporations, I think ASEAN is the most important, which you mentioned just now. And I'm very glad you mentioned that Singapore is now coordinator for the ASEAN-India dialogue relationship, which is for 3 years. And I hope very much during these 3 years that Singapore and India can work out innovative ideas and projects which will be a mutual benefit both for India and ASEAN.
All right, Professor Jayakumar, I'd like now to shift focus to China and its expansionist policy in the region. How do you view the Cold War between the US and China and its implications at a global level? And will this change with Joe Biden taking charge?
The implications are quite serious for the world, what you refer to as a new Cold War, because I think for stability and order in the world, we need equitable relations between the two superpowers. Yes, there will be areas of disagreement. Yes, there will be tensions, but they have to be managed in a calm and orderly way. Will it change with the Biden administration? I doubt very much that you'll see an evaporation of the Cold War.
Right.
This is because the apprehension in America about China being a strategic competitor or strategic threat, that fear of China is bipartisan, both Republicans and Democrats. But I think you may see a return to what I would call traditional diplomacy under the Biden administration. I think the temperature will come down. I think you'll find a greater willingness to have engagement and talks. And so let us hope that indeed the tensions will be reduced and there'll be an effort by both parties to solve the problems in a calm and amicable way.
Right. Professor Jayakumar, my final question as we wrap up this interview. Tell us a little bit about the core 4G leaders or the fourth generation leaders in Singapore who are expected to take over the helm and the governance challenges that they will face in a post-pandemic world. And what have been the biggest lessons as we hope to come out of this pandemic?
The 4G refers to the fourth generation. I was in the third generation under Mr. Goh Chok Tong's prime ministership and Mr. Lee Hsien Loong's prime ministership. The fourth generation consists of able ministers who are helming the government's fight against COVID. They're at the forefront in our fight against COVID. They have regular briefings to the media and to the people. And I think they've done a good job in being transparent, in unfolding the government's plans with each phase of this crisis as they evolve.
Right.
And never hesitated to set up all the facts, even if cases were going skyrocketing at one stage. Now, what are the lessons to be learned for them for this COVID crisis? I would say that the main lesson is twofold. One, the government has to do its part. Two, the people will have to do their part. Let me explain. The government has to put in place the necessary plans, facilities, healthcare facilities, resources, community facilities, contact tracing, quarantine facilities, and must be able to enforce in order to combat this crisis. But there's a limit to what the government can do. For effective management of the crisis, as shown in many countries, you need the population to cooperate and do their part. Like, for example, wearing of masks, observing social distancing, making hygiene a part of your life, washing hands and so on. This is important because the COVID crisis has shown in many countries that human behavior and human willingness to accept restrictions on a sustained basis is limited. And in some places, they have rebelled, they have opposed such measures. I'm glad that in Singapore, that the population by and large has been very responsive.
Right.
So the takeaway from this crisis is the government has to do its part and do its part as best as possible. It has to communicate with the people and harness their support for the measures which are necessary. This is not easy when the enemy is invisible. In a wartime situation, when you have bombs and rockets and missiles causing physical damage, it's easier to get the message to people to stay indoors.
Right.
But this COVID crisis is entirely different. So that is a challenge for governments.
Right. All right, Professor Jayakumar, that now brings us to the end of this insightful interview. Thank you so much for joining us on WION World is One, and thank you for your time.
And thank you very much for having me.
Absolutely, it's been a pleasure. WION World is One is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news updates on the move.